Welcome to Inside Communications Radio. I'm Mike Bako. Today we're joined by Barb Jones. She is the Senior Director of Communications for Ground Floor Media. Barb, thanks for joining us today.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about reputation management and coming back from bad PR situations. Certainly, if you just look at the news of late, we have everything from the Penn State scandal, moving forward to the Costa Concordia tragedy at sea, and now just recently things that were going on with the Susan G. Komen Foundation. You write very interestingly about your time in Mexico and about a specific letter that you received as you were leaving your stay. Tell us, just a little bit about that letter and how it led you to think about reputation rehabilitation.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I was visiting Mexico, a place I've been many, many times, and as I was checking out of the hotel, they handed me a letter, thanking us for our stay. But the biggest thing that they were trying to communicate in this letter is, tell your friends and family that Mexico is safe. It's a great place to travel. The issues that are dominating the news around, beheadings and killings and gang warfare are taking place thousands of miles away, and certainly those kinds of things impact tourism. So that's really what they were trying to communicate. And it's interesting because even before I took the trip to Mexico, I know of, friends and family that were concerned or said, we're delaying our trip, it's dangerous. So it's incredibly challenging, for a place like Mexico. And now, look at the cruise industry, as you just mentioned. They've got a lot of rebuilding, reputation building, trust rebuilding to do with folks that are considering, investing in a trip.
Have you found that the entire industry gets put under a specific pall when something like that happens? As you mentioned, you mentioned the cruise industry. Is it just Carnival Cruise Lines, Costa Concordia, or do you think that there's a pall placed over the entire cruise industry when something like this happens?
No, I think it impacts the entire industry. Just like when there's an unfortunate, like a jetliner crash, for example. It really puts the spotlight on the entire industry, which hurts everybody. So, yeah, it's definitely something that I think has an impact on the entire industry.
Let's take a look at some of your steps and your tips for overcoming some of this and mitigating some of the damage that can be done in these situations. You talk about acknowledging and accepting responsibility, which, again, going back to this cruise line situation, Carnival and the ship captain, and there was a lot of putting off on someone else's plate some of the responsibilities that should have been taken place at that time. Tell us a little bit about how you could acknowledge and accept responsibility.
Well, I think it's coming right out and admitting your mistakes and having a plan of action and communicating that for what changes are going to take place so that this doesn't happen again. The Komen, I think I just read a few minutes ago that the VP of Communications has since resigned, but that's a perfect example. They were making these plans for over a year, and we don't know exactly what happened, but for them to think that, they could just sort of make these changes and no one was going to notice. So, certainly planning on the front end is huge, but assuming you are caught off guard and there is an issue and you don't have a plan in place, you've got to quickly rally the troops, admit what had taken place and identify and quickly communicate what those steps are going to be that are going to move you forward.
And in this changing media landscape, how important is it to reach out to all segments of media, not just reaching out to, say, the New York Times or NBC News or the major networks and major publications, but really taking it upon yourself to reach out to Facebook followers, Twitter followers, really just engage with your core audience? How important is that?
It's absolutely critical, and certainly from a social media standpoint, that's immediate, and I understand, and I hate to keep using the Komen example, but it took them a couple days to start responding. They needed to have a social media crisis plan in place within minutes so that they were monitoring all of the posts and all of the communication and interacting with their target audiences. Our target audiences are not just paying attention to us via traditional media, the newspapers, radio, television. Our target audiences are engaging with us and monitoring us through social media, so you absolutely have to be on top of social media, and that has to be built into your crisis response plan.
Now, this plan that you would hope that an organization would have, how important is it to continue with that plan once the situation, the tragedy, whatever it is that you're in the news about subsides? How important is it to rebuild some of those relationships? And again, we're going back to the Susan G. Komen situation. How important is it to then reach back out and try to mend fences, not just get the story out, but actually bring them back into the fold?
Well, and that's the piece that, can take months or years. It is rebuilding those relationships with your target audiences. It's building trust. It's slow and it's painful, but you can't ignore it. You have to continually communicate with your target audiences. So, yes, there's first acknowledging, and then there's telling, what you're going to do to fix the situation, and then there's the ongoing communication with all of your target audiences to communicate the progress, to communicate what you've done. That is absolutely critical, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time to rebuild those reputations, unfortunately.
You're listening to Inside Communications Radio. We're joined by Barb Jones. Barb, one of the other interesting things that you bring up is the aspect of forgiveness. Have we actually forgiven BP? Have we forgiven Goldman Sachs? They go on business as usual. We certainly see public service announcements paid for by BP for people to come down to the Gulf Coast region and that surrounding area. But what have you found about forgiveness? Can these businesses go on as business as usual?
Well, and that's really interesting because you're right, with BP, Goldman Sachs, in fact, I think I just read in the news yesterday that Goldman Sachs is looking for a new head of communications. But that definitely takes a long time to rebuild trust and from the community, from the people who are following these companies. It can be done, but it's going to be a really long process. And certainly BP, unfortunately, everybody remembers the blunders that they made early on. And absolutely, we know that they've been out there. They've been doing the cleanup. We're all seeing the TV spots, and I think that's probably helping. But it's just got to be a long process. And that's why I think, handling a crisis effectively on the front end by first having a crisis plan in place can go so much further to, helping fix things on the back end and helping repair a damaged reputation in a shorter time frame.
And as you mentioned, there really is no silver bullet or shortcut. This is something that companies and organizations need to work on and have a plan implemented along the way, and I think you've certainly outlined a lot of that. Barb, thanks for joining us today on Inside Communications Radio.
Well, and thank you so much for having me.